My brother Ben, he lived with schizophrenia, and that was really the beginning of the end for him. The sound of that death clock is so loud internally. I remember the moment when the police came in and said there's no way he could have survived. The mental health system is shit. Yeah, I did the walk along the Bibbulmun track, and I did that 10 months after Ben died. I ordered a guidebook online and mistakenly bought the wrong one, and mine started about 800 kilometres before the traditional starting line. So for me, it was about 1,750k. I got on the plane and thought, oh, shit, what am I about to do?
Don't Be Caught Dead, the show bringing stories of death back to life. Here's your host, Catherine Ashton.
Today I'm speaking with Sarah Eagle. Sarah is a neurodivergent public speaker and consultant. She supports companies to create a culture of belonging and neurodivergent people to transition from chaos to joy. I had the pleasure of meeting Sarah at a recent networking session. Thanks for being with us, Sarah.
It's my absolute pleasure, Catherine. Thank you for inviting me along.
Now, Sarah, we got chatting recently and you told me about your experience when your brother died. Are you comfortable to share that story?
Yeah, I'm really comfortable to share that. So my brother Ben, he lived with schizophrenia for many years. He was diagnosed as a teen, and he had a fair bit of support with it. He had a psychiatrist. This was in the 80s and 90s, so there wasn't internet to Google things. We didn't have support as a family to understand what schizophrenia was. It was just this, his behaviour would become really unusual a couple of times a year, like scarily, like we were scared for him. That was well managed there for a while. Like through most of the year, he'd be okay. And usually around Christmas, he would become really unwell with hallucinations and really high levels of paranoia. And he managed to hold down a full-time job as a gardener and had a busy social life, friends. He didn't ever really go near drugs. That was never his thing. And then in 2000, he saved up to travel on his own through Europe, and he came back home. He was there for 6 weeks and came back home really tired, maybe from the jet lag and the travelling, and he was really unwell again. And that was really the beginning of the end for him. He was 29. I guess the schizophrenia at that point had really overtaken his brain. And we really did try to get him support. But again, back then, there really wasn't much available. We couldn't access things as readily as people can now, information in particular. I remember I took him to a psychiatric emergency one day because it was really frightening, and we needed to get him help. And he was hallucinating the whole way. He could see lights, bright lights, and these creatures were coming for him. And fortunately, I could get him to the hospital, and the hospital didn't really treat him with much dignity or kindness. In our view, in the family's view, he was gravely unwell. But the hospital just said it was up to me to decide, do we want to admit him or not? Making it really clear if he was admitted, he would get much worse because he'd be around people who were more sick than him. I didn't know much about the mental health landscape at that time. I didn't know much about stigma or how much funding goes into mental health, ill health. And I kind of went with what the experts were sort of saying, that you're better off taking him home. So that's the option I chose. So I took Ben home, and we had the crisis assessment team come out to him a couple of times a day. But the issue with that was they would send different people out. So when you're dealing with somebody who's very paranoid, they could never establish a rapport with him. So he became increasingly unwell, and we were reporting that back, but we weren't being listened to because he was over the age of 18. There were so many other things happening. They couldn't, because of the legislation, they can't take on board so much what family are saying, and they have to weigh it up in comparison to other people that they're tending to, that triage system. So eventually we found he was running across, lived near Nepean Highway in Moorabbin, and he was running across the main road there during peak hour. And he couldn't recognize us anymore. The schizophrenia really was, I don't know if you know much about schizophrenia, it's when the senses are really lying to the person. So you could see things that aren't there, you can hear things that aren't there, but the brain cannot tell whether it's real or not. So it's very real for the person. And so poor Ben was in that really distressed space where there's not one person in the world could he feel that love and connection with, because his brain is absolutely overfiring and not functioning. He was running across the freeway in peak hour, and we thought, this is, if he gets hit by a car, that will destroy him and it will destroy the person driving. We have to get him somewhere safe. And the hospital wouldn't take him. There was nowhere else to take him that we knew of. And so we took him, or my dad took him up to Tangel Bren, which is up in Mount Bauble, Victoria. And Dad built a house up there when he was about 18. Dad's now 87. This little humble shack in the rainforest, a beautiful place that we've spent a lot of time as kids going up there a lot. And usually that would be a beautiful, peaceful place that would calm Ben down. But unfortunately, within a couple of days, he went running out into the bush. He went, I think maybe on the second day, he ran out and he came back, but he was covered in leeches and cuts. And then he went out a second time. This was, I think, like a Wednesday evening in summer, so January 2001. And Dad called me about 3 o'clock in the morning. Ben's gone out and he hasn't come back. So I drove up thinking, Ben will be starving when he comes back in the morning. So I went to the 24-hour supermarket and got heaps of food to cook up a feed for Dad, Ben's best friend, Yui, who was there, and for Ben, thinking, they need some support up there, and we can, not for a second did I think we'd never see Ben again. And I got up and the sun was just coming up and the first police car was there. So Dad had obviously called the police to notify, we've got an unwell man who's now out in the forest. I pulled up next to the police car and I didn't think much of it. I just thought, this is a bit dramatic. Ben will be really embarrassed about this. I said, hey, went up, saw Dad and Yui and cooked them breakfast. And then with the town, which is tiny, it has one little shop that only opens in winter. By about 11 in the morning, there would have been 200 or 300 people there searching, or the search was starting. I think we had lots of SES walkers, volunteers, walking groups, police. It became a little hub of searching. They had sniffer dogs and they'd set out sand traps during the day. They knew that he was paranoid, so he would have been hiding. So they put sand on the ground so they could find footprints if he was moving around. And so, unfortunately, they didn't have any luck finding him. They did find his tracksuit pants with his medication early on. And then it was really a waiting game, where every moment you just don't know. It was like really living a nightmare, that every moment you don't know whether they're going to find him. Is he going to be okay, or is he going to be very sick, very wounded? Has he got an injury, or is he going to be dead? So you're living in that state from one moment, 1 second to the next, not knowing how is this going to play out.
That must have been horrific.
Yeah, it really was horrific. That kind of experience, I think, leaves a scar that is so deep, it's so permanent, that panic, that sense of deep helplessness that I cannot resolve this.
And how old were you, Sarah?
I was 26 at the time.
Yeah, wow.
And so you go through that with, all the police and the search crew. Everybody initially is sort of, we'll be right, we'll get there, we'll find Ben. And then over the days, you can see it. You can just see that it's summer, there's not much water. The police constantly evaluate how long might this person be able to survive out there under these conditions. So we always knew that there's a deadline that they have to stop the search looking for somebody who's alive and then transition to look for somebody who's passed away. The sound of that death clock is so loud internally. The search party, the police, you can see their demeanour change as that deadline, in the truest sense of the word, is approaching, and they can't look you in the eye because they personally, it's devastating for everybody. People who are there searching because they're out there in the forest, hacking away. It was a really dense forest. until, they can't look you in the eye. It's just too much for everybody. Hope is gone because there's no way he could have survived after a certain amount of time.
Do you remember what time frame where they came to you as the family and said, this is no longer an active search, this is more a recovery?
So they kind of, I guess, prepared us for that from the get-go. They were very transparent. This is what we are doing. And if we don't find him by this time, we will need to change. So there's they mention that a few times every day. And I think it was the Wednesday evening that he went missing. I actually have no idea. And then I think it was the 19th of January. So he might have gone missing on the 15th. And then on the 19th was the day the police came and said that we're calling it now. So maybe it was 4 or 5 days. I can't remember. Because I was out there on the tracks calling out his name, really trying to call out that it's a very distressing thing to do. But yeah, so it is very confusing for me to know how long that happened. But I remember the moment when the police came in and said, this is it now. I've never felt it. It's like my heart, if your heart could physically break, the sensation, that was what it is like. That moment was my heart physically felt. The pain was so unbearable, I could not breathe again.
And what happens when they say, look, we haven't found him? What happens then?
So at the same time, they said to us, we need to go on the news in case he'd gotten off the mountain. So his photo went up as well. So they were also searching in key spots around Melbourne, and they were checking his bank accounts. Was he deliberate? A lot of, I think it's 40,000 people go missing in Australia every year. And some of those people are choosing to go missing. They don't want to be found due to family abuse or trauma or whatever. And so they check, has he been accessing anything? And he hadn't been. From there, I think they took a couple of days off, but then they bring a different lot of dogs that are looking for a cadaver. So the search continues then looking for remains for a week or so from memory. And then they call it and say, no, this is not going to be something, we can't keep looking. And so from that point, we had a memorial for Ben in March rather than a funeral because we didn't have his body.
And where did you hold that memorial?
That was in a church in Bentley or Murrumbina.
And is that what motivated you to then go into the field of psychology, or had you already?
Yeah. Well, I'd started psychology at uni and loved it and then deferred. It was about 3 months after Ben had died where I felt very much that I was at a crossroads. I started to hear about the mental health system. I started to hear things like, why was he discharged? I started to reflect on things that the psychiatric nurses had told us, how Ben was treated. If he hadn't have been discharged, would things be different? So I started asking why? Why is this happening? What's going on? And then I heard about Sane Australia. But how did we not know about Sane Australia? This is not right. As a family with a loved one who's been seriously unwell for many years, how did we not know that there's a lot of support out there? I really remember in grief, shock, the trauma of it, feeling I have a choice here. I could see it very clearly. If I don't do anything, I will be very bitter and twisted and angry. Or I can see this as a silver platter because Ben's death was just very strategic, very conscious. Ben's death was very public. So I could use that to educate and to let people know there's support out there. So for me, it was a compulsion. It was not a choice, this crossroads. It was, but I was not going to choose the path of being bitter and twisted. I wanted to give Ben's death meaning as a means of making sense of it for me, that his death, his tremendous suffering, to die on your own, terrified of friends and family in the forest because the mental health system is shit, is not good enough. We need to increase the funding. We need to let people know what's out there.
And tell me, how did you get involved with Sane Australia and what is Sane Australia?
So before Ben died, I was living over in Western Australia in Margaret River, and he came to visit. And I had this old beaten up Commodore, and it was like the Dukes of Hazzards. The windows didn't work, so we had to jump through the windows. That's why it was the Dukes of Hazzard. And so I took him on a little tour around.
Sorry, I just love the 80s reference. Thank you.
Wasn't that a great show? So I took him around because I lived in Margaret River, and we travelled around for a few days. And there's a track called the Bibbulmun track, which is a walking track that goes for 1,000 kilometres from north of Perth all the way through the beautiful forest down to Albany. And after our time together, Ben bought the guidebook for this walking track and said we should do this one day as a walking holiday. And so we planned to do it as a lovely thing to do, but also we'd raise money for some kids' charity. I think it was at that 3 months mark after when I realised my life is going to go one of two ways here. I rang the kids' charity that Ben and I had lined up and said, I'm not doing it. We're not doing it. My brother's dead. It was probably something really blunt like that. Like, I've got nothing in the tank. We're cancelling that. And then I contacted Sane and said, I've just heard about you and this is what's happened. It's not okay that we didn't know that you were there. Yeah. And so Barbara Hocking was the CEO of Sane Australia back then. Beautiful woman. She's since passed away. So Sane Australia is a national body that provides a lot of resources and supports for people with mental health issues. They're a really fantastic organisation. They've got a forum for people at the moment. I'm not so involved with them now. But they do things like if there's a computer game that's derogatory around any mental health issue, they will try and prevent that from entering the country. Like, they're really big on educating around stigmatising language and improving the mental health landscape. So Sane were really supportive of what I wanted to do and helped me, really. So a friend of mine designed some Sane t-shirts and we sold those and raised money to go to Sane to help their support line, because they also have a support number that people can call for help. Not emergency help, but for advice or what resources are around in my area. And so, I did the walk along the Bibbulmun track with Ben's best friend, Yui, who was there when Ben disappeared from the shack at Townsville. And I did that 10 months after Ben died, giving talks along the way to school groups and community groups and raising money for Sane.
And how long did that take? And what's the distance and the terrain? What's it like?
Well, I have to say we were very lazy and only did 600 kilometres of the 1,000.
Oh, that's still pretty sizable.
Yeah. That was my first overnight bushwalk. The terrain, it's beautiful, beautiful terrain. They have these little huts that are built along the way that are 2 or 3-sided and long drop toilets and tank water. So you've got to check, you've got to ring or you've got to find out, is there water in the tanks? And some stretches, there was one stretch that was 10 days we had to carry food and water. Probably not water, just food. And that area of Western Australia is just stunning. You could walk through the Valley of the Giant Trees and there's so many different parts. Beautiful, peaceful, didn't see anybody along the track. And I think the reason why it took 6 weeks is because there was so many giving talks along the way to different groups. It could have been much quicker.
And how was that experience of talking to the different groups along the way? How were you received?
I think it was, in hindsight, I was still in shock. And I remember people looking at me with a lot of sympathy and I couldn't stand it. People had a lot of sorrow in their eyes. And so I needed to move away from that part. So I actually found going into towns very exhausting emotionally because I had to pretend that I'm okay. Yeah.
And were you aware that, or had you been diagnosed as being neurodivergent at this stage?
Not at all. No, I wasn't diagnosed. So I was 26 then. I was diagnosed about 4 years ago and I'm almost 50. But what I did in memory of my brother was a big reason that the psychiatrist said, this is autism. this relentless why. Why did this happen? And I cannot stop. I have to keep going down this rabbit warren of why. Why did that happen? And this compulsion, this social justice. I can't not do this.
And that wasn't the only walk that you did, was it, Sarah?
No, no. So you walk down through the forest and you get down to Albany on the beach, the sort of southern area of Western Australia. And I remember sitting on the beach almost at the end thinking, that was good, Ben. Chatting to Ben in my head. And, I think we'd raised about 10 grand and Sane had said that had an increase in phone calls. So that felt really good. So why don't we do another one? I'd be happy to do another one. And so that's when I promised Ben I would do the Camino, which I then did maybe 4 or 5 years later in Ben's memory.
And can you explain where the Camino is, what it connects, the terrain, the distance?
So the Camino is an old pilgrimage. It's about 1,000 years old. And there's lots of branches of it through Europe. And most people know the part that goes on the top part of Spain, almost along the coastline, but about 200k inland. It's a beautiful walk. I ordered a guidebook online and mistakenly bought the wrong one, as you do. And mine started in Le Puy, which is about 800 kilometres before the traditional starting line or the well-known starting line in just before you get into Spain. Most people start in the French side at the bottom of the Pyrenees and go up and over, but I started 800 kilometres before that part. So for me, it was about 1,750k. That's my second overnight walk. And I did this one solo. Yeah.
How did you train for that?
Well, I didn't really. I had some sponsorships through Fernwood Gym and other supports, but I was very, very busy with media and with marketing and public speaking. I gave lots of school talks and community talks, I'm about to go on this walk, and there's lots of services available. There's, the stigma is really high and we need to address this. So I was doing all of that. So I did not get to train. And I remember the very first, it wasn't until I got on the plane, when you're so busy before you go on a holiday and then you get on the plane and you think, yep, now I can relax. I got on the plane to France and thought, oh, shit, what am I about to do? Like, what have I signed up for? And so travelled all the way down to Le Puy, a little train, and that very first step, of course I've overpacked and I've got about 500 kilos in my backpack. Of course, I always overpack. I think it was 28 kilos, which is stupid. And I was standing at this cathedral, which is the first step, just thinking this is the first step of so many. I will always remember that step. Like it's like an emotional moment to think of that very first step of that walk.
And how'd you go?
It's interesting when I reflect on the different walks that I've done. The first walk, I spent my mind was a lot in a fantasy world, pretending I was somewhere else. I couldn't be in the moment because it was too hard. Life was hard. The emotions were hard. The second walk, I had done some meditation practice, mindfulness practice, Vipassana, practicing being in the moment. And this made the trip a lot better, I think, because when you can practice being mindfully aware of what's happening, there's more ease when you're doing something that's so long on your own. I think it's kind of, if you compare it, I think time is more gentle with you if you can lean into facing it rather than distraction and avoiding it. That's my theory. I learned a lot in the second walk. I had some really pivotal moments, which I've talked about, and there's created a little music thing, which I'll share. I don't know if you've seen it, Sarah's Mantra, in memory of Ben. These were words that I came up with.
Yeah, on your website.
Yeah. So I came up with that actually at Fernwood Gym, listening to that music. And it was about a month before, thinking, oh my gosh, I've got to do this and I'm really frightened. And those words came to me then, and I used those words in every public talk that I gave in the lead up to that trip with that music. I explained to people that this is not just for Ben, it's for every person who's died from mental health issues or suicide. It's for all of us that have suffered as family friends and loved ones. I'm going to go off on my own, but I want you all to be with me. So I'd play that music and have the words on the screen, and people would be really reflecting on their own loved ones, and you could see tears. And so when I was on that walk, I would listen to that music all the time, and sometimes the same over and over and over, especially during dark times when I felt really flat and really overwhelmed.
You had so much weight on your shoulders, and I'm not talking about the backpack.
No. And this is the really interesting part. This is probably the most profound moment of that walk. So in the Camino, about 200k before you get to the end, there's this huge cast iron cross, and pilgrims put pebbles on the bottom. And so you carry your burden for the walk, and then you place them like a ritual at the bottom. And I carried some stones with the words that I'd written as part of that mantra in this funny little glad bag in my bra that was really tattered because, sweaty and gross. And
Yeah, and your
I,
straps and
yeah, my
yeah,
straps
like
and
from the backpack.
everything. Yeah,
Yeah.
this tatty, I've still got the tatty little thing and the prayer. And I had a pebble for Ben and a pebble for mum and dad and my sister, for me, but for all people who have died from mental health issues and all who will. I was really carrying, and I knew which one was which, and I can feel that is exactly how I walked this. This is exactly the intention, that this is for everybody and to give Ben's death meaning. These pebbles I knew I was carrying from Australia to leave at the base of that cross. And I was raised Catholic, but I wouldn't say I'm a practicing Catholic by any means. And so every now and then I'd do a mindful check in. Oh, that cross is coming up. How do I feel? Oh, whatever. I'll just chuck them there and keep going. But the day that I got to the base of that cross, wow, I can feel that now as I talk to you. I took my backpack off, and I took the pebbles out of my bra and out of the little crappy glad bag that's really tatty by now, and the little mantra thing. And I held the pebbles, and I didn't want to let them go, Catherine. I can't leave all of these people out under the stars, under the elements. I can't do it. But I walked up. It's a huge mound of pebbles that other pilgrims have left. You've got to walk right up it. It's amazing. And apparently they move them on because they get so many people walking through. So I got to the base of the cross, and I was really, really didn't want to let them go. And I sort of dug a little hole into the pebbles, like to sort of create a little cave, a little safe haven for all of these things that all these people I've been carrying. And it took me ages to let it go, gently put them down and then covered them up, and finally walked down the mound. Suddenly, at the bottom of that mound, I felt absolute rage. I really felt like throwing myself down on the ground and hitting the earth. I felt, and I didn't do it, I felt like screaming, I'm doing everything I can. It is your turn. This was so full on. And then I sobbed. I absolutely sobbed because, as you mentioned, you were carrying such a heavy load. I had this sudden awareness of exactly that I had been carrying something that was not mine to carry. It was absolutely a profound moment of release and relief. There was it was humility too, I think. I'm feeling teary now. I'm happy to feel teary, but it was such a strong realization and such a powerful healing moment.
It sounds extremely emotional. And when you said, it's now your turn, who were you referring to?
Yeah, I think it was probably more the universe at large, something much bigger than me.
And did you do another walk after that?
So that really taught me, I think that level of insight of what I'd been doing really helped me understand this has to be a community effort. This is not about one person, it's got to be a collective. And so that helped really change my focus then to make it a collective, to make it more of a community focus. And so that's what shaped the next walk. I didn't know at that point I was going to do another walk, but I got to the end of that walk in Spain on the beach, and in the place where I was staying, where the walkers stay, they always had a little guest book that people would write in. And somebody just before me had said, if you love this, go to the 88 temples in Japan. And I thought, well, here we go, Ben. That's the sign. And so I said to Ben, we're going to do that. So from that point,
Oh my goodness.
yeah.
And did you?
Yes, I
88
did.
temples
In Japan?
in Japan.
Yes.
And when you say this was more of a collective, how was this one different?
So from there, I created in the first walk, was it the first walk or the second walk, Walking Feet, FEAT. And that was like a little newsletter that I sent out to people. I'm over, here and I'm doing this. And then Walking Feet then morphed into a community of people who were passionate about changing the mental health landscape. I put a call out, I need some volunteers for an event, and I would have 70 people within 24 hours. And I really got to understand that Walking Feet became a bit of a vehicle for people to be passionate, that, there's so many people with mental health issues. There's so many of us dissatisfied with the mental health landscape, the lack of funding and the stigma, that Walking Feet became a little mini vehicle for people to get behind and support. I now understand, having been diagnosed autistic and ADHD, why Walking Feet couldn't get to where I wanted it to be. Because there's certain parts of my brain that just can't do certain things. And so I no longer carry the shame of that, but that really inhibited the success of Walking Feet as a community-focused initiative. It was incredible because part of that, I also walked, and this is where the autism ADHD diagnosis makes so much sense to me, because when I finished the Japan walk, I then walked Armidale, New South Wales down to Melbourne. And that was about, I know it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. It's over the top. So, and that was again, the people that I met on this, it's just phenomenal that so many people who are affected by mental health issues. It's so many stories, so much suffering. And at the same time, I was trying to do a PhD, which is so ADHD. If I can jump back a bit with the Camino walk, the two main things I walked away, that it has to be a community thing because there's so many people affected by this and I can't change it. It's got to be collective. And I needed to increase my credibility. So I decided to do a Bachelor of Psychology with honours to give me a much louder presence or voice and understanding as well. And then that led on to a PhD, which I didn't ever complete for several reasons, but I was trying to do that whilst in Japan and walking and trying to manage this big group of volunteers, and which I don't think I did very well in hindsight. I did my best, but, got to learn somewhere, somehow. But the PhD was an interesting experience because I could have done anything I wanted. And I found that really overwhelming, I need actually clear guidelines. So that doesn't work for my brain, but I didn't know that then. But I started reading the research around mental illness, and it was so depressing. After 3 months of reading the latest research, it was all about deficit, risk and loss and the suffering, and people have short lifespan. And really, I would be crying that there's just so much suffering in here. I can't do a PhD if I'm going to be this distressed doing it. And so I decided to flip it around. Well, how can mental illness enrich people's lives? So I started looking at, where's the research on that? And, there's thousands of research papers on how bad mental illness is, but I think I found maybe 11 that looks at, could you gain things from having the experience of a mental illness? So I found that really interesting. Why are we not looking at this other side? And I'm convinced if we took the spotlight off all the horrible things and we put that spotlight on the amazing things, that this would help reduce stigma. It's our fixation on all the hardness, that all the suffering adds to the stigma.
And at what point in time, Sarah, did you become comfortable in your own skin? Because for me, I was surprised to hear about the trauma of your background, because when I hear you speak and when you've told me your story, I find someone who has very clear perspective in you no longer are feeling shame or guilt. You don't seem to carry that. At what point in time, or do you now, feel that you're okay with where you're at?
I think it was the diagnosis of autism and ADHD. It was like putting on a cloak of compassion. I could finally understand it's not that I don't belong, it's not that I don't fit in, it's actually the architecture of my brain is okay. It's not my fault. That's been a process. I know there's times I still feel shame, but I can talk about I'm feeling a lot of shame right now, and that's okay. And sometimes I do get hooked into it, but I get out of it so much more easily now. Absolutely, I think understanding and learning about my own brain and its limitations and its strengths has been the best thing for me.
And it seems that you've recognized what your strengths are and then where you need support. And so you've actively sought, I think you've got a business manager and a PA to assist you.
Yeah. So I have really crap executive functioning. Really bad, really, really bad. And it's an interesting mix of ADHD and autism in that, I've got really great ideas, very much a big picture person, but following through, finishing anything is really problematic. So I've purposely built my business to support my brain. So I run regular co working sessions for my clients because I need that too. And I'm very transparent about that. And I also think it's good to normalize that it's okay that we need these things. Let's shine a spotlight on the shame because the more we can say, yeah, I feel ashamed about this, and we can all relate, then the shame dissipates. So we feel better. So yeah, I set things up to support me, and I have a person who helps me keep on track and keep focused. I don't envy her because that would be a very very hard role, and a VA that helps as well. There's still a lot of things I need to learn. There's still things I'm identifying where I need extra support. There's so much to learn. I think probably one of the strengths through diagnosis is when I notice that there's an issue in my business, I get the help that I need rather than feel shame about it. It's a lot more pragmatic. Let's just, right, I'm really crap at that. Who can I get to help me with it?
Yeah, great. And tell me, since you've been diagnosed, when you reflect back on your grief and the walking, the finishing of one walk, moving on to another walk, at what point in time did you become settled where you didn't have to keep walking?
I think a big shift happened. And again, it would be my focus of attention went from all of the suffering that's out there. And I really feel this compelled to help alleviate the suffering out there. And then realizing actually, I've got a lot of suffering in here. That's where I need to put my attention. And that was around the time of diagnosis. Somebody who's diagnosed late, I'm not sure if you're familiar with the common pathway to diagnosis is the shits usually hit the fan in somebody's life. And that certainly was the case for me, that everything was overwhelming. Sensory processing disorder, burnt out, very distressed. Yeah, I really had to shift my attention and connect with, okay, yes, there is suffering out there and there's suffering in here. And I can't do anything out there if I haven't tended to what's in here. And I think this is where I'm at now through joy diving, is that it's a blend of tending to me with my clients who I see very much I'm walking alongside with and offering what I can for them, if that makes sense, rather than giving everything outwards.
And can you talk a little bit about that process, about how you engage with your clients? What do you take them through? I like that you talk about walking alongside. Can you just explain what that involves?
Yeah, it's the most, I absolutely adore what I do. It's the most because I can really relate. I've got the career experience. I've worked as a forensic clinician with behaviours of concern and supporting people, helping somebody to find the motivation to make positive change. And I've also got the lived experience. And so when I meet with a new client, I explain to them I'm kind of like a tour guide of your brain. I'm not the expert of your brain, but I bring with me expertise that you may not have. And that's partly from my own lived experience and partly from my career and my education. And so it's very much a collaboration. And if I was to work with you, I'd say I would ask you some questions. How are things working? What are your obstacles? What are your challenges? And I would give you a hypothesis and say, this is what I'm thinking is happening. How does that land for you? And we'd work together. Am I on the money with that? And then we'd come up with experiments and say, do you want to try this for the next week and report back to me and see how you go with that? And people come to me usually in a state of distress. They're just about to be diagnosed, or they've just been diagnosed, or maybe in the last 12 months. And it's such a beautiful process to see them develop self-literacy of their own brain, because it's not about an autistic brain does this. It's about how does your brain operate? How are you getting dopamine? What are the signs of low dopamine for you? How does your brain process sound and light? And what could you try to protect and preserve your energy based on your brain? So people come back to me with, you can see their confidence building, they're connecting with themselves and their brain, not through the lens of this is what an expert's told me, this is what I'm discovering about my own brain. It's amazing.
And tell me, what's the future for joy diving?
Oh, Catherine, could be anything at this stage. So joy diving is I have really big plans, because my number one goal is to alleviate suffering as far and as wide as I possibly can in a way that's really sustainable for me. And I mean financially, mentally, energy, everything. So the one-on-one consultation is a really big part, but I'm just starting to move into corporate, working with employees that are about to get fired or they're struggling because of their neurodivergent brain. There's a mismatch between management and the client. And that's really great because it's about upskilling and educating all parties there. And it's not about blaming. You can get so much out of this employee. We've just got to make a few tweaks, and support the employee as well. There's also some courses that I'm creating at the moment that I'm really hoping will help people. There's also creating a polyvagal tool to support clinicians and people to map out their own nervous system.
Polyvagal? Could you explain that term?
Polyvagal theory was created by Stephen Porges. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. And it's based on the nervous system. You might have heard of fight, flight, fear, or fawn, those responses. So it's a lovely framework and it's theoretical, but I really love how it explains the different states of the nervous system and how to transition safely between. And we can really learn when I'm in fight, flight, fear, or fawn, or if I'm dissociated, or if I'm feeling safe and connected with others. Just a lovely language. And neurodivergent brains have a much larger amygdala, which is the emotion center of the brain. And so our nervous system is likely to be well and truly overactive, especially by late diagnosis, navigating a neurotypical world for so long without realizing the supports that we need to get through life. Yeah, so it's a beautiful framework to help give us a language around identifying what's happening for us.
And you're working on a model that people can use?
Yes, it's a really great model that I've been trialing, because I think a big thing in learning about our own brains is connection with somebody else, like doing this with somebody else and getting feedback and encouragement rather than just going off and doing your own course. So what we're developing at the moment is a two-way system where somebody can track where they are at and learn the signs and symptoms of where they are at within polyvagal theory on the ladder of where is their nervous system, with tailored tools to help them support their nervous system and gain a sense of safety if that's what they're missing at that time. So if you were my client and you would have access to this, you could fill out your own data and we could meet weekly and look at what's happening for you over the week and then apply different strategies and tools that are perfect purpose fit for you.
And from memory, with what you've said previously to me outside of this interview, was you've seen the difference when someone who's a client and then the partner of the client,
Yeah.
and you can see. Do you want to explain a little bit about that within the
Yeah.
realm that you can?
Yeah. Yes. So I have clients who have been late diagnosed autism or ADHD or both, as well as comorbidity, other mental health issues. And they may have been struggling for a very long time to understand what's happening. So I work with families, so not just the person who's got the diagnosis, but with their partner or their children or the whole family. And using polyvagal theory, not just polyvagal theory, I've coined a term. I've often wanted to say that. I've coined a term, sensory lifestyle medicine. So using polyvagal theory and sensory lifestyle medicine and tracking our dopamine seeking behaviors. This creates a language for somebody to chat with their partner about. And so you can bring in, it's kind of like if you have a behavior support plan, like if somebody's distressed, this is how you can respond to help them not be distressed. This is the kind of thing I'm developing with clients and their partners and children. So if you see me distressed, this is how I want you to respond to me, and that will help me regulate. And so through upskilling in a really supportive, non judgmental way, families are learning to support each other when they're in a state of distress in a very respectful, empowering way. It's absolutely so beautiful.
And from these results, people have been able to de escalate issues arising just because there's now a common language.
Yeah, so it gives partners a communication like so they can communicate with each other. Like the communication really is totally different. So after 6 to 12 months, they are communicating in a way that is totally would have been very foreign to them 12 months ago. And we're seeing things like the time somebody is extremely distressed or suicidal is much shorter. The recovery is much shorter. The sense of shame and feeling really bad about yourself from having a dysregulated time is much shorter. People are getting back on track so much quicker. It's also where partners are able to help prevent dysregulation by saying, there's one couple who came up with, they created little cards they could say, if I give you this card, it means I think you're becoming dysregulated. And so that means if I was to be given that card, my partner saying, oh, Sarah, I think you're becoming dysregulated. Oh, yeah, okay. I might go do some deep breathing. So that means I'm going to calm my nervous system. That's an evidence based strategy when you're breathing slowly and deeply. It's physiologically impossible to panic. So that helps to, it's one of the many strategies that can help bypass really big dysregulation and distress. It's really amazing. Very proud of my
It's
clients.
fascinating getting these results. And you should be extremely proud.
They're amazing people.
And looking back at your lived experience, do you think, and this is just from the outside looking in, do you think your inability to communicate with Ben when he was escalating, do you think that's why you've really focused on the ability of communication and clear communication?
That's a really good question, Catherine. I think that, yeah, I think you've probably hit the nail on the head. When somebody is who's that distressed and we cannot reach them and they're at risk of suicide or dying or harming themselves, yeah, that's probably speaks to that deep scar that I have not being able to reach Ben. I hadn't thought of that. I think you've hit the nail on the head. But it's very important to me to help people feel safe in their own body because the moment when we don't feel safe, we don't have access to our frontal lobe where we can reason and problem solve. And it can lead to, in the extreme case of with schizophrenia, like my Ben could only see monsters. He thought family were monsters and we were taking out his liver and heart. If we can avoid that, by supporting each other to feel safe in our own skin without shame because we're different.
And Sarah, what advice would you give to family members who might find themselves in a similar situation to you when someone is escalating? What would you recommend, or even grieving because they've lost a loved one?
If you have a family member with a severe mental health issue or mental health issue, I think the most important thing is self-care. This is such a common experience as a carer, as a partner, or a sibling, or a parent. Their own personal self-care is usually way, way down on the bottom of the ladder. We cannot really help somebody co-regulate or to regulate their own nervous system if we're not looking after ours. So I know people think it's really selfish to prioritize your own self-care, but I like to flip it and say it's actually you're not helping if you're not looking after your own nervous system. And I say that with compassion and empathy, not as a you should, but to try and help people shift that viewpoint that you actually need to care for you as your number one priority above your loved one who's very unwell. So if that means you need extra support, get the extra support. If that means get in a cleaner if you can, get in a cleaner. If that means see a psychologist, see a psychologist. There's help for anybody who's grieving. I'm sorry for your loss. I know how hard it is. Feel it.
I can't thank you enough for your time today, Sarah, and just sharing your story about Ben. And it's something that very few people ever experience in their life, is losing someone and literally having them go missing and not
Mm.
know what happened. So thank you for being very honest and open with your story.
You are most welcome. Thank you for listening and inviting me to talk about it. It's really lovely to reconnect with the sense of purpose and meaning. Really appreciate it.
Well, it certainly sounds like it's embedded in what you're doing every day nowadays. Thanks so much, Sarah.
Don't be caught dead forgetting to subscribe. And here are some more videos we know you'll love.